Thanks, Dara. Ba mo weachas a go bháil leis an co-ordination an riachta speisialta as a gur hiúirtam leabharsla biniu faoi an fáil tam a chuir rih hefig is of course is a question seo an éir, and I thank the NCSE for the invitation to speak to you this afternoon on our welcome of refugees and migrant children to the Irish education system, including those, of course, with special education needs. There we go. So, in any response, including a response to refugee and asylum seeker children, you would normally expect the playbook would say, I suppose, there should be a framework, there should be data, evidence, a plan in advance of the process kicking off. But if you look at and it was made very clear to make a very much a global view of this. It's about, obviously, Ukraine has been very much a focus of our response in the current year, but take a global view geographically and conceptually. If we take just, for example, the war in Ukraine this year alone, climate change, building for decades, we're more aware of it throughout data and evidence, and other global trends. You might say we don't have the luxury of those things. You have to respond in real time, notwithstanding the build-up to the outbreak of war, horrific and all it has been. It still kind of took the world by surprise in some respects. And when you take those trends into consideration, be it climate change, be it other trends, be it war, at a very practical level, people are arriving, and families and children are arriving via any number of routes, geographic in one sense, and the numbers can vary literally from one day to the next. And unfortunately, in the case of war, for example, the end might not be clearly in sight at all. So you keep going, but this is quite clearly not a project in any sense of the word. And even within the country itself, then here in Ireland, when they come to our shores, the accommodation, as we know from the media reports alone, is a very challenging issue, and it could be anywhere in the country. So from an education point of view, that's quite challenging. There's the entry into the country in the first instance, the unknown numbers, the unpredictable patterns. But within the country, then, families can be moved very often, in their interest, but nonetheless, it's quite upsetting, we would acknowledge. They can be moved anywhere in the country, and the schooling system is expected to respond. And that can bring significant pressures. So that's quite a challenging backdrop to this. But it's not as if there are no frameworks. So taking the Ukrainian context, for example, alone, the EU did activate the Temporary Protection Directive at the outset, basically meaning that in that case, Ukrainian citizens were entitled to the same access to education, for example, in our case, as Irish citizens, Irish being EU citizens in this context. And look at the experience of COVID, for example. It's very clear we've learned a huge amount from that. Our capacity to respond to crises, our capacity to respond to unpredictable pressures, to schools opening, schools closing, and so on. There's huge experience has been gained in the system at every level, from the ground up, and how you respond to challenging circumstances. Unpredictable. Who would have known at the outset of COVID, for example, that a vaccine would be discovered in the space of about a year? That was certainly not known in March 2020, and we can remember that moment very vividly. So the relevant point here in terms of our learning, our confidence, our capacity to respond, yes, it's challenging, yes, it's hugely traumatic for the people themselves, fleeing a war, fleeing a climate event, for example, and it's challenging for us too, but we know we can respond. And if you look at SEN alone in its own context as well, there is again a policy framework. There are resources in place throughout the system and can be drawn down. So again, not starting from ground zero. And in many respects, probably in one of the most crucial respects, the fundamental principle does not change, be it for children born and have grown in Ireland since birth, or those who are arriving to our shores from different contexts. It's all about education appropriate to need. That's not changed. And as a former colleague in the NCSE would have said to me, of course, one of the other principles, what's good for some can be good for all. So you hope to understand, given the intro that Dara gave, Ukraine is very much on my mind because I'm leading and coordinating the response in the department. It has been a significant driver of our response in terms of the migrant context in 2022. But make no mistake, the focus remains on children's needs, regardless of ethnic background and regardless of where they've come from. And in terms of other principles, and those of you who've gone, like myself, to a teacher qualification, be it 20 years ago or maybe a little bit less, will all remember this. I never saw the photos until I put this presentation together. This is Abraham Maslow, believe it or not. And we all recall his hierarchy of human needs. And from a response, particularly to a migrant context, of refugees, asylum seekers, crisis of one kind or another, that fundamental principle at the bottom of the pyramid, the food and shelter, that takes precedence over all else, including, as it happens, your school and education. So while education is really important, vital to progress and growth and the well-being of the child and the young person, but first and foremost, the family must have a place to live. And what this has meant in practice, from a departmental point of view, is education responding. It's a key word. It can be overlooked sometimes, but we are responding to an evolving accommodation situation, be that for Ukrainians, international protection, etc. But it has also driven, quite interestingly, given it's a crisis situation, it's a war, for example, in the case of Ukraine, that data and evidence is actually more important than ever. It's not an add-on, it's not a thing we can get to if we have time. We need good data to make sure we're tailoring our response to need, to where they happen to be, where they have been moved, etc. And so it's quite interesting to consider, in the context of a horrific war as a backdrop in the case of Ukraine, that data and evidence are absolutely vital to making sure we can respond to people on the ground. And it has also been trying to influence those decisions on accommodation over time as much as possible. Acknowledging the priority of food and shelter, can we try and align the accommodation with school capacity? Because families, once they get a chance to get their bearings, really want to get an education for their children. That seems to be a fairly universal human desire. The other piece, and I know Anne Tanzi, my colleague in the department, and Nebs is here in the audience, but I remember vividly Anne talking to me about these principles, Steven Hopful. And again, this is a good example of evidence-informed in a conflict situation, but the principles that should underpin our response to, in this case, education need. And I've crudely summarized these. I'm sure Anne would be aghast at what I've done with them. But this is my shorthand. This is my mnemonic, my way of easily remembering the principles sketch. So you're expected, even in the context of a crisis situation, to foster a sense of safety for the child and young person, a sense of calm, of efficacy, of connectedness, of hope. And what really strikes me about these principles, they may sound touchy-feely, they may sound as optional, but quite clearly the evidence indicates that they're not. They're absolutely vital to a response, and have informed our own response as a department, but our partners, of whom Des is here from in a moment, is one, the schools on the ground, teachers' principles. These principles are supposed to run throughout all our responses. So our goal has been, in responding to the needs of children in any context, an appropriate educational experience, education appropriate to need. And what that has meant in practice, it sounds perhaps a little bit vague, but actually it has to take account of the fact this has to be flexible. There must be a clear framework for the response to the needs of children and young people fleeing the situations they're fleeing, but it has to be flexible because this is a very fluid situation, and it's almost a euphemism. In some respects, for example, families are fleeing a war. They're fleeing a climate crisis, for example. The accommodation challenges that come with that, the priority of food and shelter, as I said. And against the backdrop of COVID in particular, and we have learned a lot from COVID experience in the response and our capacity to manage crises and unpredictable pressures. But the challenge in this situation with the migrant context is we have to keep, unlike in COVID where schools were all largely opened or closed at any point in time, we as a system, as a department overseeing that system, must keep the schools going for the almost 1 million pupils currently in schools, they remain open, and provide for an unknown number of new arrivals, and no end to the numbers coming, for example. So that's quite an interesting, kind of a different angle to the challenge, which makes it different from COVID. The numbers we hear about in a moment might seem small in relative terms compared to the almost 1 million pupils, but make no mistake about it, the challenge and the pressures are quite significant for these reasons. What have we done so far? So for example, here's one of the numbers. Provided access to school for over 12,000 Ukrainian children in every county in the country. Again, as I said, in relative terms, it seems quite small, almost 1 million already in schools, but when you actually break it down and all the resource and supports to go into it, that's quite significant. We've expanded the summer program, for example, to make it open to eligible Ukrainian pupils, and over 1,200 Ukrainian children availed of that. But the importance of communications, particularly in this fluid situation, not just to schools, you will note, but also to the parents. So using central hubs, for example, like gov.ie, using social media, translating our messages into the relevant languages to try and make sure we reach the parents as best we can. Because it might take some time in the beginning of a crisis like this for networks of parents to form that you could more easily engage with. So it's quite a fluid situation, lots of people coming in, but they need to hear stuff now. They can't wait for the network to form. So we've got to use the channels we have at our disposal, like websites, like social media and so on, to do our best to reach the parents, as well as reaching obviously the schools who are providing the places to the children. There's been allocation of resources across a number of different fronts. Obviously, in the first instance, English as an additional language, posts and hours been allocated to schools, a chomáile sin uaireantaí takeíochta teanga high school in Lán Gaeilge, but also language support hours for Gaeltacht schools and Irish medium schools. ESOL is an acronym, another acronym for the FETS sector broadly. The key point here is that we've made more flexible availability provided for in the case of the ESOL panels, which used to operate at FET, further education and training only, but they are available as needed to support EAL provision in post-primary schools. The special education teacher posts being provided, and also special needs assistance allocations as well. And regular stakeholder engagement. Lots of different levels to this kind of communication. There's the parents who are coming to the country, the children and young people, but also the stakeholder organisations who link into the schools in so many different ways. Take but two examples, your school management bodies and teacher unions. And everybody wanting to play their part. And I think that has to be acknowledged. Those 12,000 children enrolled in the system, that simply could not have happened without every single part of the system playing its part. The department, its agencies, its bodies, but stakeholders as well, the schools on the ground, community groups. Actually, that's not even an exhaustive list. NEPS, for example, is part of our supports, providing guidance for all in terms of particularly schools and teachers, online webinars that can be watched afterwards, and proactive engagement with schools because of that fluid situation. I'm not using that word a lot, but it's quite important in terms of the multiplicity of expectations and desires and requirements in the system, and trying to meet those in real time, but also to be accessed afterwards, like the webinars being recorded. School transport, very practical but very important resource, getting the children of the families from wherever they may happen to be accommodated to the nearest school with capacity. For schools themselves, teaching and learning resources are important. And it's quite interesting to note, while the Ukrainian response brought this forward, a lot of the resources that have been recollated on websites were already there. But what has been done, given everyone's under pressure, everyone's trying to do their best to respond to a crisis, they may not have the time necessarily to go rooting into every subpage of a website to get the resource they need. So recollating these resources and through single point access, hyperlinks for example, might seem like a simple thing to do, but it's of very practical importance to school principals and teachers in schools who want to respond, but just haven't got the time to search everything that they may need to look for. And as already been noted, I think in the previous presentation, and I've heard it firsthand on the ground myself, the professional development service for teachers being a vital support in helping schools and teachers navigate in real time the responding to the needs of children, especially in the early stages and thereafter. And of course, assessing impact is vital. And let's come back to the data and evidence piece. It's not good enough to simply put things out there and say, there you go, there's the resources that must be used. We need to know how effectively they're landing. So again, the importance of stakeholder feedback is really important there. The inspectorate themselves on the ground and their relationships with schools. The inspectorate survey that would have been sent to schools about the Ukrainian response is one example. And my colleague Des will say more in a moment about the regional education and language teams, specifically focused on the Ukrainian response, but a good example of a collaboration can work to respond to a fluid situation on the ground. And statistics, qualitative and quantitative data are both equally important. I am, if nothing else, a child of the 80s, and I was reared on the solid diet of Billy Joel and Chris de Burgh. This is Billy Joel in his latter, more senior years, and he has a great song called Trust, A Matter of Trust. And in terms of response to migrant families particularly, there's a trust we need to build with them in the first instance, of course. They're in a new country, very often a new language. But trust among stakeholders as well to respond to the ongoing situation. But let's not, to be clear, good relationships are already in place, but building in those relationships to make sure we take a whole of system view in the response, particularly in terms of school capacity. I'll come to that later on. So a key challenge, therefore, particularly against a migrant context, has been the real challenge and need at the same time to coordinate resources, expertise, insights, the care of professionals, teachers have been one example, but SNAs as well and other professionals on the ground, to help all children grow and thrive, including those in migrant communities who have special education needs. There is a bigger picture of which all children are an equally important part. And therefore, when you look at Ukraine and international protection, which might roughly translate into other countries, other contexts, the question being how much can we meet this challenge utilising existing structures and leveraging existing relationships? Ergo, Billy Joel's mantra of a matter of trust and building on that. This might beg the question, you're sitting here for almost 15 minutes now, but what's different therefore from these all sound very fine principles and responses, but what is different? Where is the differentiation for migrant children in terms of the response? Which is a fair question. Number one, looking at that context of the unknown and fluctuating numbers and the geographic variation. So in the case of normal demographic trends, it's not like it's an exact science, but we have projections from the CSO and from my own stats team in the department of what the likely growth in school demand would be from children already in the country. The key difference in this case is we simply do not know where the number will finish. So that's one of the key differences. Unknown and fluctuating numbers, the geographic variation over time, using our geodata in the department. This, therefore, one of the differentiation pieces is the need for flexible regional responses in terms of places. That's one of the key differences. So Des will say more about that in a moment. Then to tease the other one about a bit more, because there's no clear line on this one, I think. On the one hand, for those who have left their home in another country, the connection to home and home school, actually I probably got it wrong here, not only can be important, it is important, it's vital for them, their language, their culture, their heritage. On the other hand, we in Ireland, obviously, we place, I think, an appropriate emphasis on the importance of integration and inclusion. We want to welcome these people to our communities and to our schools. Therefore, we work on the basis in the department that enrollment in school is very important too. And then you might wonder, how different actually is this? Because if we look at LOV, Irish Sign Language as well, I know one is probably a subset of the other, I'm not an expert in the area, but I think that's about right. And then non-verbal autism, as a means of all different ways of communicating, all different languages. They may happen to have born and grown up in this country, but they are different languages. And COVID itself has really brought home to us as a system and society, I think it's fair to say, the importance of home-school connections and communication, more general terms, to meeting the needs of the child and the young person. That's not new, I suppose, the point I'm trying to make. And you may say, well, fine, what is the difference, so? And I think one of the differences, therefore, the scale, the pace, and the unpredictable nature of arrivals and enrollments. And I've gone through a couple of responses to that. Which has meant, on the one hand, some of the traditional processes for allocation of resources might need to be expedited, because this has happened in real time. So, for example, the English additional language application process. The eligibility was always very clear, that resources were already in the system on the books, but we fast-track the process because of the scale and pace of arrivals of families fleeing a war. On the other hand, however, this isn't one size fits all, it's almost a cliche in education now. In particular in relation to SEN, it was made very clear to us by NEPS on the one hand, by the NCSE on the other, that in terms of identification and need, you have to be very, very careful. With the best of intentions, people can rush into a space and say, we want to get this child assessed and get a diet and so on and so forth. And they're really well motivated. There's no question in the motives here. But actually, when you step back from an expert point of view, it was really important to give the family simply time to settle, to welcome and include them. Because even I can get this much myself, the trauma can impact the finding. So it's not just from a humanitarian point of view, from the reliability of the finding and support point of view, you must give families time to settle. So we understand perhaps is the line, the motivation to really rush in and do A, B, or C, but the human needs haven't changed here. And therefore, from the COVID point of view, that relational dynamic of education is of fundamental importance. It sits beneath, it overrides everything else. And in SEN, for example, therefore, we have front-loaded, once that first phase of the response would have passed by the summer coming into September, now that time had elapsed for a large number of children, but not all, because children are still coming every day. But there's been some front-loading of resources in the SCT and SNA front, based on the enrollment data. This is kind of a mix, therefore, when you're looking at a migrant response situation, there's a systemic view you must take, but local communication is equally important. The ease of access to resources for schools, for example, to respond to children's needs, the visibility of those resources. The rail coordinators, and these are the people who head those regional teams, their communication with schools on the ground, that Des will say more about in a moment. But the professional development service for teachers, one of our support services, a national service, but working very much hand in glove with schools on the ground, that's local and national. Those rail teams that Des will say more about in a moment, they are teams. The NCC are linked into those teams on the ground. TUS Education Support Service are linked into those teams on the ground. School management bodies are linked into those teams on the ground. This is where the rubber really hits the road. And school capacity planning, we're obviously responding in real time, but we also have one eye to September of next year, and mindful of a number of different trends and pressures in school capacity. The national demographics I referred to previously, children who are born in this country and are growing up in this country, SEN, linked to that set, but it's a distinct need, and then Ukrainians and migrants as well. So there are three broad pressures in terms of demand in the school system that as a department we have to take a systemic view of. And I know Minister Madigan has already communicated to schools in that regard, particularly in relation to SEN in the past couple of weeks. So what now, given we're now here in November? Even in an emergency response situation, you have to keep an eye on your strategic enablers, including in responding to migrant flows of families and children and young people, and the special needs as part of that. Targeting supports and resources, mindful of the overall picture. Utilising the full capacity of the school system. The only way we have managed as a system to enrol just over 12,000 Ukrainian children, plus other nationalities in addition to that, so relatively smoothly, is because we've taken that whole of system view of school capacity. And the school community links and connections are becoming ever more vital. That's really an important part in terms of responding to those crisis situations, those community response fora that the local authorities have stood up more recently, that were there during COVID and now form part of the response to the Ukrainian context, but important for all, because they're joining the dots between community organisations, other public services, and schools as well, because this is a fluid situation. We project total arrivals apparent by about 70,000 by year end, just to bear that as an overall picture to the backdrop of this. And we do know that pressure points are definitely building in a number of different areas around the country, particularly at post-primary, which would not be a total surprise, given we already knew from work on teacher supply that the demographic bulge is moving into post-primary, had already begun to move into post-primary. What does this mean for migrant children, however? So number one, the overall goals, as I said at the outset, still apply. The education appropriate to need, for example. The fulfilling of potential is our statement of strategy as the department talks about. But particularly in a school community context. It has drawn that forward, the response to the migrant pressure in terms of school capacity, but it's always been a fundamental principle. Schools are parts of communities. And particularly for the migrant child, welcome and care first, then education. Maslow's hierarchy, then schooling. What have we learned in terms of supporting children, and particularly from the migrant context? One, we definitely, and might know the question, what have we learned? We've learned the need to collaborate, to maintain and enhance the collaboration in the system. We need to listen to professionals, to students, to families and communities, and building that into the data and evidence we work with in other contexts. But equally, there's a horizontal dynamic, that school community context is really important here. That professionals, families and communities need to listen to each other. And when they do, good things can and do happen. We've also learned, I suppose, overall, the importance of, and from a well-being point of view, the difference between your stimulus and your response, to respond, not react, even in a crisis situation, even in an unpredictable situation. And remembering, as we've learned this year alone, but over COVID too, crises evolve, and so should our responses. And that's not to say the beginning response was wrong. It simply means we're responding and evolving our response. The importance of data, evidence, and feedback, and the importance of, again, in terms of the crisis evolving, to learn, to adjust, and to respond in terms of collaboration. That last line, there's a bit of context to it in terms of, I suppose, what have we learned? The importance of reminding ourselves as adults in children's lives that we're simply part of their growing up. That book by David Almond is one of my favorites. It was recommended to me by a teacher. My name is Mina, and Mina is a young girl in the book who, very cleverly, David Almond describes her as in ways that don't label her. So it's clear that she relates to the world in somewhat different ways from what I would as the reader of the book, but he doesn't labour that. And mine is trying to start school. And on the first day, an artist walks into the school. I think his name is Malcolm. And in welcoming her, I have a couple of minutes left, so it won't take too long, but she's trying to settle herself, and this artist is part of the welcome and introduction to mine. And remember the importance of welcome and care before education. And in this conversation, Malcolm says to Mina, I think you're brave. I think all of you are brave, coming to places like this, trying to grow up. It's hard, isn't it? And Mina responds, what is? And Malcolm says, trying to discover how to be yourself. There's many ways to do it, Mina, he says, a different way for each and every one of us. And you know what? It goes on all your life. Mina said nothing. She watched a flock of pigeons flying fast across the rooftops. And Malcolm continues, we don't mind if you think we're not the place for you. Whatever you decide, it's nice to have you with us, even if it's just for a short time. It's nice to have been part of your growing. I think it's quite resonant in a migrant context. We are welcome and we are included. And for however long people may be with us, whoever want to do themselves in terms of maintain their links to their home culture, that importance of being part of their growing for however long or short a time they may be with us. But that doesn't change from how we actually relate to all our children, as parents, as teachers. And I think that's an important principle to hold on to in the midst of all this. that it is about education, as I think has been said before, is about people helping people to learn, and that doesn't change in any context. So thank you for your time and attention. Look forward to your questions.